people can start losing weight just by making better decisions.
Motivation is driven from the inside out.
Use flexibility as a tool. Rely on structure when it's helpful.
This is where we discuss the possibilities. Hey guys, welcome to the Diet Doc Life Mastery Podcast. I'm Dr. Kori Propst, Wellness Director and Vice President of the Diet Doc. And I'm here with Dr. Joe Klemczewski, founder of the Diet Doc. Today we're going to talk about how to calculate your macros. And Joe, this is a question that I always get from my clients when we first start. I'll make some initial nutrition recommendations and I love that they will typically come back to me with, how did you figure out those macros?
Exactly. And I'm glad you posed the question that way, because that's what I was going to say. I think most people in today's environment understand tracking macros. I run into very few people who are doing any other kind of metric. It's just the thing now. So now people want to know, hey, how did you come up with that amount of protein, carbs, fat? Is this right for me? How do I know how to adjust? And just as a quick aside, before I forget to mention it, we do have a platform for that called themacrodoc.com. So it's a free service. You can go to themacrodoc.com and create a little profile through a questionnaire asking some very easy demographic information, height, weight, gender, that kind of thing. But the interesting thing about the way we do it is you have your choice between different demographic goals. For example, you might be a physique competitor. You might be somebody who trains very little. You might have a goal of losing body fat or gaining muscle or both. So all of those things are there for you to toggle between and create an entire range of macronutrient suggestions, which is basically what I want to talk about today, is how do you come up with that range that might be right for you? And then we can kind of take it from there.
Yeah, I want to say that I love the MacroDoc, and I have actually used it. I've had my clients go there and submit different entries for the different physique goals, whether it's for just fat loss, whether it's for muscle gain and fat loss, and so that, or whether it's for performance, so they can see how their macro recommendations change as a result of what the goal is. And it's fascinating for them because they see that it does shift how much protein would be optimal, carbs and fats. And so, yeah, let's dive into that. Where do you start as a clinician when a client comes to you? What questions are you asking in order to understand where to move their macros?
Well, the first thing, if you go all the way back, probably now more than 100 years, when they started trying to figure out if there was a universal system that they could create, all kinds of different variations came about. The Harris-Benedict, that was modified. Many people have jumped in and created their own. But basically what you do is start with the calorie needs of a human being. And the greatest differences are, of course, starting with gender, because of endocrine system differences between males and females. Men are typically going to have a little bit more lean body mass and thus higher metabolic rates. But then you have things like your height and your weight, because your overall lean body mass and body mass in general will make a huge difference. When you're doing a simple calculation that somebody's created some kind of an algorithm or formula for, they're not going to get into all of your different goals and nuances and all that good stuff. So it's really going to start with gender, height, weight, maybe even age. Age is a factor. As we get a little older, metabolism is going to slide. So I typically, in my brain, am going right for those exact same things as a starting point. But then you do factor in, okay, what is this person's dieting history? Because that's going to give you a bit of an indication as to what their metabolism is really capable of. Genetics are still going to create a pretty wide gap in possible highs and lows. Certainly their activity level, and then how lean they're going to end up. There's a difference between somebody who is a physique competitor, maybe a college athlete, and then just a 40, 50, 60-year-old general population client who's just trying to live their best life. So I look at all of those variables, and then I start with protein first, then I go to fat, then I go to carbs. And I'll explain that in just a second. But I'll kind of flip the table on you, Kori, and say, when somebody's coming to you, what are you really looking for? Is there anything that you do differently than I just mentioned?
I take a thorough history, just like you mentioned, in terms of what their dieting experiences have been, what their weight loss, weight gain history has been. I like to get an understanding of what their family history in terms of weight is. Do they have obesity in their family history, diabetes, some other conditions that might affect their metabolic rates? Are they taking, and I'll even ask to find out if there are medications that they're taking, because a lot of medications can influence metabolism and one's ability to lose body fat as effectively as possible. But I will also gather food diaries from them, at least for a few days, just so I can get a sense of how they're currently eating, not changing a single thing, not trying to eat healthy or modify their macros in any way, but just 3 days in the life of your nutrition. I want to see what's happening in terms of overall food consumption. What's the time? What does the timing look like in terms of your meals? How much space in between your meals? How big is each meal? I want to get a sense for the overall structure. And then, that is going to give me kind of a good idea of where their sort of maintenance level is. And then two, I may have an idea of what an appropriate amount of protein might be, for example, based on those variables that you mentioned, height, weight, age, gender, activity level. But then if I see, for example, that this woman who has come to me is only eating about 30 grams of protein a day, probably not going to be recommending that she's eating 85 to 90. You know what I mean? So it's those current circumstances that really make a difference in terms of initial recommendations for me.
Right. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was going to say, after I go through all of these calculations on how I would try and discover a good starting point, it certainly does come down to their ability to comply and be happy with that. Right. Their goals may not necessarily mean they have to go all the way up to or down to a certain level of a macronutrient that we think would be appropriate. So there really does have to be a meeting of the minds somewhere with what they would really choose to do to be successful long term.
But so scientifically, if we were going to go just like baseline formulaic sort of an approach, how do you decide on how much? Let's start with protein for a person.
Well, let me even back up a step and go back to calories. There are ways, as I said, you could use a formula. Some people have made it as simple as saying, just take your maybe goal weight, so you get a sense of what your lean body mass would be, and multiply it by 10, and there's your overall calories. There are very simple formulas like that get you in the ball game. But I would go back even further to some of the original studies where they looked at human metabolism a little bit more scientifically. And even though our government still counts a regular standard across the board, no matter your age, gender, daily requirement as 2,000 calories, that may even be too high as a mean. I mean, obviously that's low for some people, clearly somebody who's 6'5" and extremely active, that kind of thing, maybe 18 years old. And but even as an average, I think that might be high. That some of the best studies I've seen show that the actual average, where you're looking at the broad spectrum of age groups, would calculate men as a basal metabolic rate. So if you're active, you're doing some exercise, that would not factor this in. But men are generally around 1,650 calories and women around 1,350 calories. I still really haven't seen anything that beats that as an average. My experience in 25 years of doing this says that that's about right.
I mean, just anecdotally, personally, I mean, I'm 5'2", I'm 113-ish pounds. I've been here for a while. I've had my BMR tested, and I'm at 1380.
Yeah, and that's with a lot of activity too.
Yeah,
I mean, you're crushing it in the gym, on the road, with your bike.
yes.
So I would be the same way. At 1650 for a male, then you tack on your activity level. I think that's pretty appropriate. So
I think that would surprise a lot of people, though, because
oh,
food labels say average human needs 2,000 calories a day, right? And you just
absolutely.
hear all the time. And I know that when I send my clients my initial recommendations, I have to throw out a caveat. Don't let the numbers scare you.
Hmm.
Like, let's talk about how I got to these numbers, because so many people have the mindset of, you know, I need to be eating more food to lose weight. And so when they see those initial recommendations, it almost scares them, because aside from the 2,000 recommended, they're hearing never go below 1,200.
No
And
question.
I have to say that a lot of the females that I work with, if they're dieting for fat loss, they're going below 1,200, and they're not starving, they're not hungry all the time, they feel fantastic. But it's that initial perception that that's bad, that's wrong, and that's dangerous.
Yeah, and that really is, I think, what a lot of people come away from if they've read some of the pop culture magazines on nutrition. And I know last week we did a podcast talking about metabolic adaptation and how the body shifts and goes through transitions as you get leaner. I ran into that with a client just yesterday where she started losing weight fantastically. We're moving along and we're 3 to 4 weeks in, and all of a sudden you start to see that little bit of a down regulation where now she's plateauing a little bit.
Sure.
And I said, the amount of calories that you needed to sustain your weight up here is different than what it takes to lose. Not just to start losing, but then to actively lose a pound or so a week. So now we have to match that and get into more of what I would call a core phase of dieting, where we won't have to make that many changes, but we went through that initial adaptive transition. Now this is where we're going to be. And she did agree, even though, like you said, not always happy to hear that.
Mm-hmm.
She said, yes, as I go back through all of my past diets and the times I've lost weight, I absolutely have to be aggressive. And you're right. So, this matches my own experience with my history.
Mm-hmm.
And you could even look at her, body type, looking at photos and all of that, and say it's gonna take a little bit more to dig in here and get through the goal, which may be 15 or 20 pounds. So that's how I initially look at calories.
Mm-hmm.
And then it really is a little bit of trial and error. No matter how well you come up with a science-based guess, it still is something that you're guessing about in some regard, in that here's where I'm going to start, see how I do, check the data. Am I losing too fast, too slow? Even subjectively, am I hungry? Do I feel hypoglycemic, weak? What might I need to change beside calorie levels? The macronutrient profile, which we're going to go over here to wrap up, or even just the meal spacing. Been listening to as much as I can about the restricted time eating, which
I've heard about that too.
Yeah, mark that one on the list to go over, because there's some interesting stuff. I've heard some really wacky people giving interviews on YouTube, and it's so funny to hear their claims because they absolutely are antithetical to the research. They're claiming that you can eat far less, eat only in that window of 8 to 9 hours, and you can end up gaining lean body mass and all of this stuff, increase your metabolism. And of course, just instinctively that's not true. And so you go to the research and it's actually not true. So again, I don't know what they're trying to sell there. I'm sure they have books and systems out there, but
Right.
But we'll go over that another day.
Well, there are a lot of offshoots. You mentioned your core phase of dieting, and I know that you've put together, is it 5 phases?
Yeah, I kind of divide it up into 5 phases in my mind of dieting.
Yeah, and so I do, I would love to go over that in another podcast, but So overall calories first,
Mm-hmm.
and then you're figuring out how much protein. That's where you go next.
I do. And the RDA is zero point 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. So you have to go to a converter calculator online and find out the pounds versus kilograms. But
Isn't that
basic
pounds divided by 2.2
2.2-ish,
for everyone who's listening?
2.2.08, blah, 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 blah.
Okay.
Goes on forever.
So 0.8 grams per kilogram. That's
Right.
a minimum, right?
So let's say somebody like me at 175 pounds, that would calculate out to about 80 or so grams of protein, maybe even a little bit less. And so that's what the RDA would say is normal or needed for life. But along the way, and this has been going on for at least a decade, probably longer, a lot of science agencies have put that to the test. A lot of research has been done. And even at some pretty large summits where they've discussed this ad nauseum, they've concluded that about twice that amount is really a top level appropriate place to be. So if you looked at, I said that was about 80 grams for me. That's really less. It's probably in the 60s to 70s, grams. So,
and you're comfortable eating that much.
yeah, for me, doubling that would be about 125 or so grams of protein, which for some people,
which is about what I eat, and feel good doing it.
Well, and I was just going to say, there are definitely both ends of the spectrum there. For some people, 125 or so grams seems incredibly low because they've cut their teeth on a lot of the pop culture stuff in fitness and bodybuilding magazines. For the average person, that could be very tough to get because that means you're making a concerted effort 3 to probably 4 meals a day to get some high quality protein.
Absolutely.
So I will say, to your point, that 125 grams feels about right to you. I struggle to get 125 a day. There are many, many days I do not get that much, probably most days. So, there's the bookends right there just between you and me. But I will say that a lot of people have even tried to push the envelope farther, and they've studied up to 3 times that amount. And they're showing that probably is the maximum for people in certain contexts. So if you have a really fast metabolism, you're dieting, you're training really hard, just pure ectomorph genetics, you might get away with being able to use 3 times the RDA, which now that would take me up to about 200 grams a day. And I know when I was competing, I was a pro bodybuilder for about 20 years. It was nothing for me to eat 225 to 250 grams because this was just what I thought I needed, and I would forego carbohydrates, keep my fat low to do that. And to be honest, I've done plenty of body comp analysis over the years, and eating half of that helps me maintain my lean body mass just fine. So, going up to that 3 times level is not appropriate for most people.
So, okay, you just said something that kind of piqued my curiosity that I think others would be interested in. You said, I could easily eat 200 to 225 grams and forego carbs in order to do so. So let's get into carbs now. You're looking at having this much protein. Are you saying that it would be beneficial to reduce protein somewhat so that you can fit in more carbohydrates? And if so, why?
Once minimum protein requirements are met, so once you're at 1.5 to 2 times the RDA, more protein does not help stimulate your metabolism, does not help create more of an anabolic environment. You're not going to create more lean body mass. Matter of fact, you can become adaptive to that much protein, just like caffeine or anything else, and pretty soon eating that much is a detriment because now you don't have these spikes where you could be increasing a little bit. So to keep your protein where your body needs it to be, that the top level, which again for me might be 1.5, not even 2 times the RDA, gives me now more room in my calorie intake for carbs, which at that point are more metabolic and are more anabolic than extra protein. So once minimum protein levels are met, carbs are absolutely more beneficial to gain muscle or maintain muscle and keep your metabolism higher. That's why a low carb diet is typically going to be the one that decreases metabolism the fastest and studies show reduces lean body mass the fastest. So absolutely making sure that protein is not higher than you need so you can fit more carbs in does help. But then we get into, what do we do with fat intake?
Right.
What kind of a percent should that be? Or, rules. People just like to be low fat or high fat. And I really find that keeping fat low enough, if you have enough body fat, again, allows for more carbohydrates. So I think if you look at some of the studies by people who did balanced diet research, the zone type information that came out 20 some years ago, and 30% of calories is almost an ISO, macronutrient level. And that's a lot of fat, really. I mean, if you look at a 2,000 calorie diet, for example, and say 30% of my calories are going to come from fat, you're to 80, 90 grams of fat a day, and you've got to be looking. You're eating entire
Oh my
avocados and yeah. So if I'm trying to lose body fat, I like to keep fat closer to 15 to 20% of calories. If I am maintaining, then you could go to 20, 25, maybe even 30. But I think as a way of understanding how to match all of these, it takes looking at those ranges of, here's how much protein, the RDA would say for me, here's 1.5, here's 2.0. So let's kind of map that out per my lean body mass. Look at my overall calorie structure that I created in the beginning, however I decided to do that. Then take a percentage of those calories as fat, and now look what that leaves you for carbohydrates. And based on the kind of calorie deficit you might want to create, that's where you can make changes in that carb level. But then it really does come down to tracking things well. You are basically creating a science experiment out of your own experience.
Sure.
And then you get to do some more fine tuning and track results, see how you feel. I mentioned in a podcast last week, I've got a binder this thick from all the diets I've done in my life, including anthropometric measurements, body comp analysis with hydrostatic weighing, DEXA scans, things like that. All of my calories, macros, how much cardio I was doing. When you put all of that stuff on a spreadsheet and you look at that for a couple years, you've got some amazing analysis on your own physique.
Yeah. So I love how you map that out. Protein first, based on 1.5 to 2 grams per kilogram. Then a percentage of fat, 15 to 20 if your goal is fat loss. And then fill in the rest with carbohydrates. I feel like there's a big misconception about just fat in general and how much we need and how much, is healthy or not. But help me understand this one piece, because I have a way of explaining it to clients, but most of the fat that we consume is going to be stored, isn't it? If we're getting enough from protein and carbohydrates, the more fat we eat, because it's already fat, it's going to be stored as body fat. It doesn't have a high thermogenic effect.
Right. So that would be in a meal-to-meal context. If you look overall at a similar calorie level, if you decide I'm going to have 30% of my calories from fat versus 25 versus 20 versus 15, maybe even all the way down to 10, but the same amount of calories, and you test that, you're going to see that there's probably very little difference, especially in those middle ranges. If you get really extreme on one end or the other, you might. That's because even if you do store body fat from that meal, because you had a higher fat intake, you're going to have time in between meals to use it just like you would carbs. So therein lies the physiology and your own preference, and the two have to merge. So if you're somewhere in the middle and you decide, I just like fat more, I'm willing to reduce my carbs a little bit so my fat can be higher because I like some of those foods, I think you're going to find a fine line in there where you can get away with that and it's working for you. But again, if you let your carbs get too low, now you're missing that anabolic effect and metabolic effect. Even on blood sugar levels, that's a big part of satiety. And even if you're eating a lot or the same amount of calories, if your carbs are getting low, you're going to be nonstop hungry just because your blood sugar level is always very low. I don't care what the ketogenic proponents say, that's just a fact. And to your point about the thermogenesis, yes, about a 3% thermic effect from fat means that in the context of a meal where you have enough calories, up to 90% of those calories from fat are going to either need to be used or stored. And so if you have a decent amount of carbs in that meal, then a lot of that fat intake, even if it's a good fat, are going to be stored for later. So I think for the future, it would be great to go through each macronutrient one at a time and give an entire bit of literature review on some of the current studies on each one and its impact. But for today, that's exactly how I would calculate somebody's macronutrient profile, is at least a starting point.
Great. Thank you, Joe. That was incredibly helpful. I would just encourage everyone again to go to the MacroDoc and play around with it. Enter your information, your demographic information, your height, your weight, your goals, and see where you land. And then, Joe, would you agree? Then kind of reflect upon, qualitatively speaking, how much do I eat now? Would I be comfortable moving and shifting my proteins, carbs, and fats to what it's suggesting? Would I be willing to try that? How would you kind of wrap up this segment today?
I would just put it all on a spreadsheet. I would start with that. Here's the information I put in the MacroDoc calculator as far as how many meals a day I eat, how many times a week I eat out, what I'm just saying my activity level is. You can just kind of reproduce that questionnaire and then make columns as far as what the MacroDoc calculator spit out for you. So you've got those ranges. That could be your beginning point. And then, like you said, you might want to change some of that, maybe pick exactly where you want to start. Yeah. And then start tracking your food for a week or two and see how you feel. Then you can always adjust and fine tune from there.
It really is about tracking, isn't it? That's a number one behavior that we need to be literally excited about if we want to do this well.
Yeah, there are so many things that are not objective about nutrition, that anything we can anchor to that gives us some kind of stability and clarity is the best shot you have. So absolutely, tracking food, creating, as I said, records that you can go back to year after year are going to be extremely helpful.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Joe, for all of this awesome information. Guys, thank you for joining us today for the Diet Doc Life Mastery Podcast. We will see you soon. Please like, share, and we would love to hear your comments. Thanks.
Thanks, guys.